Young millionaire denies preferred seat to an elderly woman. The next day, he panics upon seeing the same woman in his boss's office. Alexander. Alex Mitchell stood in front of his Tesla Model S, staring at the completely dead dashboard with a mixture of disbelief and mounting frustration. Of all days for his high-tech vehicle to malfunction, it had to be today, the morning of his company's biggest product launch of the year. His artificial intelligence startup, Innovatech Solutions, was about to unveil a groundbreaking algorithm that could revolutionize customer service automation. And as CEO, he needed to be there to lead the presentation. The 32-year-old entrepreneur ran his fingers through his perfectly styled dark hair, his crisp navy suit already feeling uncomfortably warm in the San Francisco morning sun. He checked his Patek Philippe watch, a gift to himself after his first million, and grimaced. 8:15 a.m. The presentation was at 9, and his car wouldn't even turn on. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, pulling out his phone to call his assistant. No answer. Of course, Sarah was already at the office, preparing for the launch. His regular driver was on vacation, and ride-sharing apps were showing astronomical surge pricing due to a major tech conference downtown. After 5 minutes of increasingly desperate attempts to find transportation, Alex spotted a public bus approaching his upscale Pacific Heights neighborhood. A public bus. He couldn't remember the last time he'd taken public transportation. Was it during his college days at Stanford? The thought made him cringe, but he had no choice. Swallowing his pride, Alex jogged to the bus stop, his Italian leather shoes clicking against the sidewalk. The bus was crowded, filled with the morning commuter rush. Alex managed to find a seat near the middle, next to a window. He immediately pulled out his phone, trying to distance himself from his surroundings. The peculiar smell of too many bodies in too small a space, the chatter of teenagers headed to school, the low rumble of the diesel engine. At the next stop, more passengers boarded, including an elderly woman carrying several heavy-looking canvas bags. She was small in stature, with silver hair neatly pinned back, wearing a modest but well-kept floral dress. Despite her apparent age, there was something striking about her presence, a certain dignity in the way she carried herself. The woman made her way down the aisle, clearly struggling with her bags. She stopped near Alex's seat, looking at him expectantly. He could feel her eyes on him, but kept his gaze fixed on his phone, pretending to be deeply engrossed in an email. He heard her clear her throat softly. "Excuse me, young man," she said, her voice gentle but clear. "Would you mind giving up your seat? These bags are quite heavy, and my arthritis is acting up today." Alex glanced up briefly, then returned to his phone. "Sorry," he muttered, not sounding sorry at all. "I've got an important presentation to prepare for." He continued scrolling through his phone, ignoring the disappointed sigh from above him and the disapproving looks from other passengers. The elderly woman said nothing more, but Alex could still feel her presence. She remained standing there, swaying slightly with the motion of the bus, her bags clutched tightly in her weathered hands. A teenager several seats ahead eventually offered his seat, and the woman thanked him with genuine warmth. The rest of the bus ride passed in a blur of email responses and presentation review. Alex was so focused on his phone that he barely registered getting off at his stop, hurrying past the elderly woman without a second glance. His mind was already at the office, running through his talking points and checking the time obsessively. What Alex didn't notice was the way the elderly woman watched him leave, her bright blue eyes following his retreating figure with an expression that mixed disappointment with something else, something that might have looked almost like anticipation. She pulled out a small notebook from one of her bags and jotted something down, her handwriting precise and deliberate. As Alex rushed through the lobby of his sleek office building, straightening his tie and rehearsing his opening lines, he had no idea that this ordinary Monday morning, this simple bus ride, would become the catalyst for the most transformative year of his life. He couldn't have known that the elderly woman he'd dismissed so casually was about to become the key to his future, or that his grandmother's long-lost inheritance hung in the balance of this seemingly insignificant interaction. For now, he was simply Alex Mitchell, the rising star of Silicon Valley, a man who'd built his success on algorithms and efficiency, who measured his worth in stock prices and market share. But life has a way of teaching its most important lessons through the most unexpected teachers, and Alex's education in humanity was about to begin. The product launch went exactly as planned. Alex's presentation was flawless, the investors were impressed, and Innovatech's stock was already trending upward. By noon, he was riding the high of success, accepting congratulations from his board members in the glass-walled conference room of his downtown office. "Mr. Mitchell?" His assistant Sarah appeared at the door, her expression unusually hesitant. "There's someone here to see you about a personal matter. She says it's regarding your grandmother's estate." Alex's smile faltered. His grandmother, Elizabeth Mitchell, had been gone for 5 years, and he hadn't thought about her estate in years. The last he'd heard, everything had been settled. Not that there had been much to settle. His grandmother had lived modestly in her small Victorian house in Vermont, tending to her garden and volunteering at the local nursing home. "I'm not expecting anyone," he replied, checking his schedule on his tablet. "Who is it?" "A Ms. Margaret Henderson from Henderson & Associates Law Office. She's quite insistent." Alex was about to refuse the meeting when something in Sarah's tone made him pause. "Fine. Give me 5 minutes to wrap up here." When he entered his private office, he stopped short. Sitting in one of the leather chairs across from his desk was the elderly woman from the bus. She wore the same floral dress, but now she also wore a pair of reading glasses and held a leather briefcase in her lap. Her expression was neutral, but there was an unmistakable glint in her eyes. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying the same gentle tone from the morning, but now with an added note of authority. "Or may I call you Alexander? I knew your grandmother Elizabeth quite well, and she always called you Alexander." Alex sank into his chair, his mind racing to process this bizarre turn of events. You knew my grandmother?" "Oh yes, quite well indeed. We served on the board of the Golden Years nursing home together for over 2 decades. I was also her lawyer and the executor of her will." Margaret opened her briefcase and removed a thick manila envelope. "And that's why I'm here today." "I don't understand," Alex said, his usual confidence wavering. "The will was settled years ago. There was barely enough to cover the funeral expenses and maintain her house until it sold." Margaret's lips curved into a small smile. "That was the preliminary will, yes. But Elizabeth had a second will, one that she asked me to hold until certain conditions were met." She pulled out a document and placed it on his desk. "Your grandmother was a wealthy woman, Alexander. Very wealthy. She inherited a substantial fortune from her own grandmother, but chose to live simply. She wanted to ensure that her wealth would be used wisely and with purpose." Alex's throat felt dry. How much are we talking about?" "The current value of the trust, including investments and properties, is just over $1 billion. The room seemed to spin. Alex gripped the arms of his chair, his knuckles turning white. $1 billion? But why didn't she tell anyone? Why didn't she use it? Elizabeth believed that money should be earned, not given. She watched you grow up, saw your drive and ambition, and was proud of your success." Margaret paused, adjusting her glasses. "But she also saw something else, something that concerned her deeply. She saw you losing touch with the values she held dear. Compassion, empathy, human connection." Alex felt a defensive response rising in his throat, but Margaret continued before he could speak. "That's why she created this conditional will. The entire inheritance will be yours, but only if you can prove over the course of 1 year that you understand and embrace the importance of these values." "And how exactly am I supposed to prove that?" Alex asked, his voice tight with tension. Margaret's eyes met his, and he suddenly remembered how he'd ignored her on the bus just hours ago. "You'll work as a volunteer at Golden Years Nursing Home, the same place where your grandmother volunteered for 30 years. You'll spend 20 hours each week there, working directly with the residents, under my supervision. I'll be evaluating your progress and commitment throughout the year. 20 hours a week? That's impossible." "I run a company. I have responsibilities." "Those are the conditions, Alexander. Take them or leave them. You have until tomorrow morning to decide." Margaret stood up, gathering her belongings. "Oh, and one more thing. This arrangement must remain completely confidential." If you tell anyone about the inheritance or the conditions, the offer becomes void immediately. She walked to the door, then turned back with a slight smile. And Alexander, next time you're on the bus, you might want to offer your seat to someone who needs it. Small acts of kindness often have a way of coming full circle. As the door closed behind her, Alex sat in stunned silence, staring at the document on his desk. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, San Francisco's skyline stretched out before him, the same view he'd admired countless times before. But now, for the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about market shares or profit margins. Instead, he was remembering his grandmother's garden, the smell of her homemade cookies, and the way she used to say, "Success isn't about what you have, Alexander. It's about who you are." The Golden Years nursing home stood in stark contrast to the gleaming tech offices Alex was accustomed to. The three-story Victorian building, painted a cheerful yellow with white trim, sat nestled among mature oak trees in one of San Francisco's quieter neighborhoods. As Alex pulled up in his newly repaired Tesla the following Monday morning, he felt like a fish out of water. He'd spent the weekend reorganizing his schedule, delegating responsibilities, and creating elaborate excuses for his sudden need to be away from the office several afternoons each week. To his executive team, he'd announced he was working on a secret personal project that could benefit the company. It wasn't entirely a lie, he rationalized. $1 billion would certainly benefit Innovatech's expansion plans. "Right on time," Margaret's voice called from the wraparound porch. She stood at the entrance, holding a clipboard and wearing a practical cardigan over a simple dress. "Though you might want to reconsider your attire for future visits." Alex glanced down at his tailored suit and designer shoes. "What's wrong with my clothes?" "Nothing if you're heading to a board meeting. But you'll be helping with activities, serving meals, and possibly assisting with basic care. That suit won't last a day." She handed him a blue polo shirt with the Golden Years logo and a pair of khaki pants. "There's a staff bathroom down the hall where you can change." Minutes later, Alex emerged, feeling oddly vulnerable in the casual clothing. Margaret led him through the facility, pointing out different areas: the dining room, activity spaces, gardens, and resident rooms. The place was clean and well-maintained, but it lacked the sterile efficiency he'd expected. Instead, it felt almost homey. "Your grandmother helped design many of these spaces," Margaret explained as they passed a sunny reading room where several residents were engaged in a lively book discussion. She believed that a nursing home shouldn't feel like a hospital. It should feel like a community. They stopped at a large recreation room where about 20 residents were gathered for morning activities. An enthusiastic young woman was leading them in gentle exercises from the front of the room. "This is Lisa, our activities director," Margaret introduced them. "She'll be showing you the ropes today." Lisa bounded over, her ponytail swinging. "You must be Alex. Margaret told me you'd be joining our volunteer program. We're just about to start chair yoga. Jump right in." Before Alex could protest, he found himself standing at the front of the room beside Lisa, attempting to demonstrate arm circles and gentle stretches to the group of elderly residents. He felt ridiculous, especially when he noticed Margaret watching from the doorway with an amused expression. "Young man," a gravelly voice called out, "you're stiffer than my arthritic knee. Loosen up a little." The comment came from a tall, thin man in the front row, his white hair combed neatly to one side. The other residents chuckled, and Alex felt his face grow warm. "That's Mr. Thompson," Lisa whispered. "Don't mind him. He was a dance instructor for 40 years. He has opinions about everyone's movement." As the morning progressed, Alex was introduced to more residents, each with their own distinct personality and history. There was Mrs. Chen, a former professor who still quoted Shakespeare at every opportunity. Mr. Rodriguez, who challenged anyone willing to a game of chess, and Miss Betty, who insisted on showing Alex photos of her 12 grandchildren and 6 great-grandchildren. By lunchtime, Alex's head was spinning with names and stories. He helped serve meals in the dining room, trying to remember each resident's dietary restrictions and preferences. His usual confidence felt misplaced here. His business acumen and tech expertise meant nothing when trying to convince Mrs. Parker to eat her vegetables or helping Mr. Watson find his missing reading glasses. "How are you holding up?" Margaret asked during the lunch break, finding him in the staff room staring into a cup of coffee. It's different, Alex admitted. I'm not used to feeling so incompetent. Margaret's expression softened slightly. Your grandmother felt the same way her first day here. But she learned something valuable. Sometimes the most important work we do is simply being present for others. I don't know if I can do this, Alex said quietly. 20 hours a week for a year. These people need real help, not some tech CEO playing nurse for an inheritance. Then maybe it's time to stop thinking about the inheritance, Margaret suggested, and start thinking about the people. Each person here has a lifetime of experiences, wisdom, and stories to share. Your grandmother understood that. She didn't just serve meals and lead activities. She built relationships. She listened. She cared. Alex thought about his grandmother's warm smile, the way she always seemed to have time for everyone. He'd always attributed her kindness to simple, small-town values. But now he wondered if there had been something more, something he'd missed in his rush to build his empire. As he prepared to leave that afternoon, Mr. Thompson called out to him again. Hey, Mr. CEO, same time tomorrow? Alex hesitated, then nodded. Yes, sir. Same time tomorrow. Good, the older man replied with a wink. We'll work on those arm circles. Can't have you embarrassing yourself in front of the ladies. Walking to his car, Alex loosened the collar of his polo shirt and took a deep breath of the late afternoon air. His phone had been buzzing all day with notifications and messages, but for the first time in years, he felt no urgency to check it. Instead, he found himself thinking about Mr. Thompson's dance career, Mrs. Chen's favorite Shakespeare sonnets, and the way Miss Betty's face lit up when she talked about her grandchildren. One day down, hundreds more to go. And somewhere, he suspected, his grandmother was watching, perhaps with that knowing smile she'd always worn when she knew something he had yet to learn. 2 weeks into his new routine, Alex found himself juggling two increasingly demanding worlds. At Innovatech, his mornings were filled with investor meetings and product development reviews. His afternoons at Golden Years brought a different kind of challenge, one that couldn't be solved with algorithms or market strategies. Your positioning is all wrong, Mr. Thompson instructed, standing behind Alex in the recreation room mirror. When you lead the movement class, you need to be more fluid. Watch. The former dance instructor demonstrated a graceful arm movement that, despite his age, carried years of artistic refinement. Alex attempted to mimic the motion, feeling oddly self-conscious. His phone buzzed in his pocket, probably Sarah with updates about the upcoming board meeting. But for once, he let it ring. Better, Mr. Thompson nodded approvingly. You know, you remind me of my son when he first started dancing. All business, no flow. But he learned, just like you're learning now. Where is your son now? Alex asked, realizing he'd never heard Mr. Thompson mention his family before. A shadow passed over the older man's face. He moved to Europe 20 years ago. We don't talk much anymore. Different priorities, I suppose. Before Alex could respond, his phone buzzed again, this time more insistently. With an apologetic glance at Mr. Thompson, he checked the screen. Multiple missed calls from Sarah and a text that made his stomach drop. Emergency board meeting called. Major investor threatening to pull out. Need you here ASAP. I'm sorry, Alex said, already reaching for his jacket. There's an emergency at work. I have to go. Mr. Thompson's expression was unreadable. Life's full of emergencies, son. The trick is knowing which ones really matter. Alex hurried through the halls, almost colliding with Mrs. Chen, who was carrying a stack of books for the afternoon reading group. Slow down, young man, she called after him. To borrow from Shakespeare, wisely and slow. They stumble that run fast. In the parking lot, he found Margaret waiting by his car. Important meeting? She asked, her tone neutral. A key investor is threatening to pull out, Alex explained, fumbling with his keys. This could cost the company millions. And what's the cost of the commitments you're breaking here? Alex paused, his hand on the car door. I'm not breaking anything. I'll make up the hours tomorrow. That's not what I meant, Margaret said softly. Mr. Thompson was going to share his story in today's memory circle. He specifically asked if you would be there to hear it. The weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. I I didn't know. No, you didn't. Because you're still treating this place like an obligation rather than an opportunity. These people are sharing their lives with you, Alexander. Their hopes, their regrets, their wisdom. Your grandmother understood that these moments, these connections, are precious. His phone buzzed again. Sarah. Board members arriving in 15 minutes. I have to go, he said, but the words felt hollow. Of course you do, Margaret replied. But remember, your grandmother's inheritance isn't just about the money. It's about understanding what truly holds value in this world. The drive back to his office was a blur of conflicting thoughts. In his rearview mirror, he could still see Mr. Thompson's disappointed face, so similar to the expression his grandmother used to wear when he missed their weekly dinners for work emergencies. The board meeting was intense. The investors' concerns were addressed, contracts were renegotiated, and by early evening, the crisis had been averted. Alex should have felt triumphant, but instead, he felt oddly empty. That night, sitting in his luxury apartment overlooking the bay, Alex found himself doing something he hadn't done in years, looking through old family photos on his laptop. There was one of him and his grandmother at his college graduation. She was beaming with pride, but now he noticed something else in her expression, a hint of concern perhaps, as if she could see the path he was choosing. His phone lit up with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of Mr. Thompson, surrounded by residents in the memory circle, his hands animated in mid-story. The message below from Margaret read, he was telling them about the day he chose his passion for dance over his father's business. Sometimes the most expensive choices we make aren't about money at all. Alex stared at the photo for a long time. He thought about Mr. Thompson's son in Europe, about missed conversations and lost opportunities. He thought about his own grandmother, who had possessed wealth beyond imagination, but chose instead to invest in people, in relationships, in moments that couldn't be measured in dollars and cents. Opening his laptop again, he began to type an email to his executive team. The subject line read, New priority structure for afternoon commitments. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a small acknowledgement that perhaps some emergencies could wait, while other moments, once missed, were gone forever. As he drafted the email, he could almost hear his grandmother's voice. Time is the only currency that matters, Alexander. Spend it wisely. 6 weeks into his time at Golden Years, Alex found himself in an unexpected situation, organizing a surprise birthday party for Miss Betty's 85th birthday. The idea had started small, just a cake and some decorations in the recreation room, but somehow it had grown into something much bigger. No, the streamers need to be higher, Mrs. Chen directed from her wheelchair, gesturing emphatically at the decorations Alex was hanging. Betty may be turning 85, but she notices everything. Remember what Shakespeare said, God has given you one face, and you make yourself another. We want this party to show her true face, elegant and full of joy. Alex adjusted the streamers, smiling despite himself. Over the past weeks, Mrs. Chen's literary quotations had become less intimidating and more endearing. He'd even started reading King Lear during his lunch breaks, hoping to surprise her with a quote of his own. His phone vibrated in his pocket, another message from Sarah about the upcoming IPO preparations. The initial public offering had been his dream for years, the ultimate validation of his success. Now somehow it felt less urgent than making sure Miss Betty's party was perfect. Alex, dear, Mrs. Rodriguez called from where she was arranging flowers. Did you remember to call Betty's granddaughter in Chicago? The one who's a pilot? Yes, Maria's flight lands at 2 p.m. I'm having my driver pick her up and bring her here for the surprise. Alex checked his watch. And Mr. Thompson is rehearsing with the choir one last time in the garden room. The choir had been Mr. Thompson's idea, a group of residents performing Miss Betty's favorite songs from the 1950s. Alex had spent hours helping them practice, learning more about music from that era than he'd ever expected to know. Alexander. Margaret's voice came from behind him. She rarely used his full name anymore unless something was serious. There's a call for you in my office. It's your board chairman. Alex's stomach tightened. The IPO preparation meeting was scheduled for this afternoon, the same time as Miss Betty's party. He'd planned to send his CFO in his place, but from Margaret's expression, he knew something had changed. In Margaret's office, the chairman's voice was clear and unyielding through the speakerphone. "Alex, the investors are insisting on your presence. This is a crucial meeting. The entire IPO timeline could be affected. I know you have some sort of personal project going on, but this is about the future of your company. The car will pick you up in 30 minutes. Alex looked at his watch again. The party was in 2 hours. Miss Betty's granddaughter would be arriving. The choir needed his help with the sound system. He'd promised to be there. "I'll have to call you back," he said, and ended the call before the chairman could respond. Margaret, who had been quietly observing, raised an eyebrow. That seemed important. "It was. It is." Alex ran a hand through his hair. "The IPO. It's everything I've worked for. The investors are expecting me. The whole company is counting on me. And what about the people here who are counting on you?" Through the window, Alex could see the residents bustling around the recreation room, preparing for the party. Mr. Thompson was demonstrating a dance step to 2 other residents. Mrs. Chen was carefully arranging birthday cards. In the corner, he spotted Miss Betty's favorite chair, where she always sat to show him new photos of her grandchildren. "When I first started coming here," Alex said slowly, "I thought I was the one doing them a favor, spending time with them, listening to their stories, organizing events like this." He gestured at the party preparations. "But they're the ones who've been teaching me, aren't they?" Margaret smiled. "Your grandmother used to say that the greatest lessons in life come from the people we least expect to be our teachers." Alex pulled out his phone and dialed the chairman's number. "Tom, I'm sorry, but I won't be at the meeting today. I trust Sarah and the team to handle it. Yes, I understand the implications. No, this isn't negotiable. Some commitments can't be broken." After ending the call, he turned to Margaret. "The investors might pull out. The IPO might be delayed. I might have just cost my company millions of dollars. And how does that make you feel?" Alex looked again at the recreation room, where the residents were now gathering around Mr. Thompson as he demonstrated the proper way to hang a birthday banner. "Like I'm exactly where I need to be." 2 hours later, when Miss Betty arrived for what she thought was afternoon tea, she found the room transformed. Streamers hung from the ceiling, flowers adorned every table, and her favorite songs filled the air. But it was the sight of her granddaughter Maria, standing among the smiling residents, that brought tears to her eyes. As Alex helped serve cake and took photos of Miss Betty hugging her granddaughter, his phone remained silent in his pocket. There would be consequences tomorrow. Angry investors, concerned board members, endless damage control. But watching Miss Betty's face as the choir performed "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," seeing the joy in her eyes as she looked around at the community that had become her family, Alex knew he'd made the right choice. "Well done," Margaret said quietly, appearing beside him. "Your grandmother would be proud." "I'm not doing it for her anymore," Alex replied, surprising himself with the truth of the words. "Or for the inheritance." Margaret's smile suggested she'd been waiting for him to realize exactly that. The morning after Miss Betty's party, Alex's office felt different. The floor-to-ceiling windows that once made him feel like he was on top of the world now seemed to separate him from something more important. His inbox was flooded with urgent messages, and Sarah had already rescheduled 3 emergency meetings before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. "The Peterson Group is threatening to withdraw their entire investment," Sarah reported, her usual composed demeanor showing signs of stress. "And the board wants an explanation for your absence yesterday. They're gathering in the conference room now." Alex straightened his tie, a gesture that had once felt like armor, but now seemed merely habitual. "Thank you, Sarah. And I'm sorry for putting you in this position." She paused at the door, surprised by the apology. In 5 years of working together, she'd never heard him apologize to staff before. The board meeting was exactly as difficult as he'd expected. 10 faces around the polished conference table, each wearing an expression that ranged from confusion to outright anger. "Would you care to explain," Board Chairman Tom Reynolds began, "why you chose to skip a crucial IPO meeting for what I'm told was a birthday party at a nursing home?" Alex took a deep breath. A month ago, he would have crafted a clever explanation, found a way to spin the situation to his advantage. Instead, he chose honesty. "It was a commitment I couldn't break," he said simply. "Sometimes being a leader means understanding that not every important decision is about business. This company is on the verge of a billion-dollar IPO," Patricia Chen, one of the major investors, interjected. "Your behavior lately has been concerning. The random afternoons off, the delayed responses to crucial emails, and now this. Are you still committed to this company's success?" Alex looked around the table, at the faces of people who measured success in stock prices and market share. He'd been one of them, not so long ago. "I am committed," he said carefully, "but I'm also learning that success can be measured in different ways. Yesterday, I chose to keep a promise to people who count on me. Not for money or business, but for something more fundamental: human connection." "Human connection doesn't keep the lights on," Tom snapped. "It doesn't satisfy shareholders." "No," Alex agreed, "but it might make us a better company." He stood up and walked to the whiteboard, picking up a marker. "Did you know that our customer satisfaction ratings have actually improved over the past month? Our employee retention rate is up and sick days are down." He drew a quick graph, the kind of presentation he'd done countless times before. But this time, he saw the numbers differently. "Since I started volunteering at Golden Years, I've learned something valuable about our AI customer service platform. We've been so focused on efficiency that we forgot about empathy. Yesterday, I watched an 85-year-old woman light up because someone took the time to understand what mattered to her. What if we applied that same principle to our business?" The room was quiet. Patricia Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression thoughtful. "I'm not suggesting we abandon the IPO," Alex continued. "I'm suggesting we make it better. What if Innovatech became known not just for its technological innovations, but for its human touch? What if we created AI that doesn't just solve problems, but actually makes people feel heard and understood?" He told them about Mrs. Chen, the former professor who quoted Shakespeare to make complex ideas more accessible. About Mr. Thompson, who taught him that sometimes the best way to lead is to step back and let others shine. About Miss Betty, whose joy at her surprise party showed him the true value of keeping promises. "Our current AI is efficient, but it's cold. It processes requests but doesn't understand the human element. I think we can do better." "I know we can do better." By the end of his impromptu presentation, the energy in the room had shifted. Patricia Chen was taking notes, and even Tom's stern expression had softened slightly. "You have 1 month," Tom finally said. "Show us how this new perspective can improve our product. If it works, we'll adjust the IPO timeline. If it doesn't," he left the threat unspoken. Later that afternoon, as Alex walked into Golden Years, he was greeted by the usual warmth and activity. Mr. Thompson was teaching a new resident some basic dance steps. Mrs. Chen was deep in discussion with her reading group about Hamlet. Miss Betty was showing her party photos to anyone who would look. "Rough morning?" Margaret asked, appearing beside him. "Actually, no," Alex replied, surprising himself with the realization. "For the first time in my career, I feel like I'm exactly where I need to be, doing exactly what I need to do." Even with the inheritance at stake, Alex watched as Mr. Thompson successfully led his new student through a simple waltz step, both of them laughing at their small victory. "You know, I haven't thought about the inheritance in weeks." Margaret's knowing smile reminded him so much of his grandmother that it made his heart ache. "Then perhaps you're finally learning what your grandmother wanted to teach you all along." As he rolled up his sleeves to help set up for afternoon activities, Alex's phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Chen. "Your grandmother Elizabeth was right about a lot of things. Looking forward to seeing how her wisdom shapes Innovatech's future." Alex stared at the message in surprise. How did Patricia know about his grandmother? But before he could ponder this mystery, Mr. Thompson called him over to help with the music system, and Alex found himself once again choosing the present moment over past questions or future concerns. 3 months into his time at Golden Years, Alex sat in his office late one evening, surrounded by photographs spread across his desk. They weren't company charts or market projections. They were old pictures from his grandmother's house, which he'd finally taken the time to sort through. One photo in particular caught his attention. His grandmother at what appeared to be a technology conference in the 1980s, standing next to a much younger Patricia Chen. On the back, in his grandmother's neat handwriting, Elizabeth and Patricia, Silicon Valley Women in Tech Conference, 1985. The pieces were starting to fall into place. Patricia's cryptic message about his grandmother, her thoughtful response to his new vision for the company. It hadn't been random at all. His grandmother's influence reached further than he'd imagined. His computer pinged with a video call request from the Innovatech development team. They'd been working late nights on the new empathy-driven AI platform, incorporating insights Alex had gained from his time at Golden Years. "We've made a breakthrough," Jamie, his lead developer, announced excitedly. "Remember how you mentioned Mr. Thompson's way of reading body language during dance instruction? We've incorporated similar pattern recognition into the AI's visual processing. It can now detect subtle changes in facial expressions and adjust its responses accordingly." Alex watched the demo with growing excitement. The new AI didn't just process requests, it observed, adapted, and responded with genuine warmth. They'd programmed it to learn from real human interactions, much like Alex himself had been learning at Golden Years. "And look at this," Jamie continued, pulling up another screen. "We've implemented what we're calling the Mrs. Chen protocol. The AI now contextualizes responses with relevant cultural and literary references, making interactions more personal and memorable." The next morning, Alex arrived at Golden Years earlier than usual, eager to share his progress with Margaret. He found her in the garden, tending to the roses his grandmother had planted years ago. "Your grandmother loved these roses," Margaret said without turning around. "She used to say that technology can make life easier, but it's the simple things that make life worth living." "Did you know she was involved in the tech industry?" Alex asked, showing her the photograph he'd found. Margaret's eyes twinkled. "Elizabeth was involved in many things. She believed in building bridges between people, between generations, between technology and humanity. Patricia Chen wasn't the only successful person your grandmother mentored. Why didn't she ever tell me? Would you have listened?" Margaret's question was gentle but pointed. Sometimes the best lessons can't be told. They have to be experienced. Their conversation was interrupted by Mrs. Chen calling from the patio. "Alex, come quickly! Your Mr. Thompson is about to make a very important call." Inside, Alex found Mr. Thompson sitting by the computer station, staring at a Skype screen. On the display was his son's contact information in Europe. I thought it was time," Mr. Thompson said, his voice uncertain. "After what you said about connections being more important than pride. But I'm not sure I remember how to use this thing." Alex pulled up a chair beside him. "Here, let me help. I'm pretty good with technology." He paused, then added, "But you're the expert on what to say." The call connected, revealing a middle-aged man who shared Mr. Thompson's high cheekbones and kind eyes. For a moment, father and son just stared at each other in silence. "Dad," the son finally said, "is everything okay?" "Everything's fine, Michael. I just wanted to see your face. And maybe if you have time, we could talk about dance." "About anything, really." Alex quietly stepped away, giving them privacy. In the hallway, he found Margaret watching him with approval. "You know," he said, "we're implementing a new feature in our AI that helps older users connect with their families through technology. Simple interfaces, patient guidance, emotional support. We're calling it the Bridge Builder Protocol." "Your grandmother would have liked that name," Margaret smiled. Later that afternoon, Alex received another message from Patricia Chen. "Just saw the demo of the new empathy-driven AI. Elizabeth always said technology should serve humanity, not the other way around. Looks like her grandson finally understands what she meant. Full investor support for the new direction. Take the time you need to do it right." As Alex watched Mr. Thompson emerge from his call, tears in his eyes but smiling, he realized something profound. The inheritance his grandmother had left wasn't just about money. It was about understanding the true value of connections, whether they were built through technology or tender conversations, through business innovations or simple acts of kindness. He pulled out his phone and opened his calendar. The IPO meetings and board presentations were still there, but now they shared space with Golden Years activities, resident birthdays and volunteer hours. Somehow, these two worlds weren't competing anymore. They were complementing each other, creating something stronger and more meaningful than either could be alone. "You're looking rather pleased with yourself," Mrs. Chen observed, wheeling past with a copy of The Tempest in her lap. "Just thinking about how everything connects," Alex replied. "Like Shakespeare said, 'We are such stuff as dreams are made on,'" Mrs. Chen finished with a smile. "Your grandmother used to quote that one too." The invitation arrived on a crisp autumn morning, its gold embossing catching the light in Alex's office. The International Innovation Summit, keynote speaker Alexander Mitchell, revolutionizing AI through human connection. The prestigious tech conference in Singapore had been his dream platform for years. The dates were perfect, the timing ideal for promoting Innovatech's new direction before the IPO. There was just one problem. It coincided with Golden Year's annual Heritage Week, a 5-day celebration where residents shared their life stories, cultural traditions, and family histories with the community. Alex had promised to help organize it months ago. "This is an incredible opportunity," Sarah said, examining the invitation. "The publicity alone would be worth millions. Every major tech publication will be there." Alex turned the invitation over in his hands, remembering how his old self would have responded, already mentally drafting his keynote speech, planning meetings with potential investors, calculating the impact on stock prices. Now, though, other calculations weighed on his mind. Mrs. Chen was planning to share her experience as one of the first female Asian American literature professors at Berkeley. Mr. Thompson had choreographed a special performance incorporating dance styles from different cultural traditions. And Miss Betty had been working for weeks on a family history presentation, practicing her speech with Alex every Tuesday afternoon. "Block the dates," he told Sarah, "but don't confirm yet. I need to think about it." At Golden Years that afternoon, the atmosphere was buzzing with Heritage Week preparations. Residents were sorting through old photographs, rehearsing stories, and setting up display tables. Alex found Margaret in her office, reviewing the schedule. "Singapore?" she asked, noting his distracted expression. "The invitation arrived, I presume. How did you—" "Patricia Chen mentioned it might be coming. She sits on the selection committee." Margaret set down her papers. "Your grandmother spoke at that same conference, you know. 1992. She turned them down the first time they asked. Why? She had made a promise to be here for something important." Margaret's eyes held his. "She always said that success means nothing if you have to break promises to achieve it." Before Alex could respond, a commotion in the hallway drew their attention. They found Mr. Thompson on the floor, surrounded by scattered papers, his dance notation sheets for the Heritage Week performance. "Just a little dizzy spell," he insisted as Alex helped him to a chair. "Nothing to worry about." But the doctor who examined him later that day disagreed. "Your blood pressure is too high," she explained. "You need to rest. No dancing for at least a week." "But the performance—" Mr. Thompson's voice trailed off, his usual confidence faltering. "I'll do it," Alex heard himself say. "I'll learn the choreography. You can direct me and I'll teach the other dancers." Mr. Thompson's eyes lit up. "You'd need to practice every day. Multiple hours. The performance is complex. Then we better start now." That evening, Alex sat in his apartment, the Singapore invitation on one side of his desk, the Heritage Week schedule on the other. His phone buzzed with a message from Tom Reynolds. "Singapore conference could make or break our IPO timeline. The board expects you to be there." Another message followed, this one from Patricia Chen. "Elizabeth chose Heritage Week over Singapore in '92. The conference happened anyway. But the people she stayed for never forgot her choice." Alex closed his eyes, remembering something his grandmother once told him. "Success is like a mirror, Alexander. Make sure you're proud of the reflection you see." The next morning, he walked into the Golden Years recreation room, where Mr. Thompson was waiting with his dance notes. "I thought you'd be on a plane to Singapore by now," the older man said. "Some things are more important than keynote speeches." Alex rolled up his sleeves. "Now, show me that first sequence again." For the next week, Alex lived in two worlds more intensely than ever. Mornings at Innovatech, overseeing the empathy AI development, and handling investor concerns about his declined Singapore appearance. Afternoons and evenings at Golden Years, learning complex dance steps, helping residents prepare their presentations, listening to their stories with new appreciation. His muscles ached from dancing. His voice grew hoarse from practicing cultural songs with Mrs. Chen. His patience was tested trying to coordinate group movements with residents of varying physical abilities. But something else was growing too, a deeper understanding of what his grandmother had meant about success and reflection. The day before Heritage Week began, Margaret found him alone in the garden, running through dance steps one last time. "You know," she said, sitting on a nearby bench, "the inheritance stipulation only required you to volunteer here. It didn't specify giving up international speaking opportunities or spending extra hours teaching dance." Alex paused mid-step, realizing she was right. Somewhere along the way, the inheritance had stopped being his motivation. "I'm not doing this for the inheritance," he said. "I'm doing it because—" He gestured at the building behind them, where residents were still busily preparing for tomorrow. "Because this matters. They matter." Margaret smiled, looking for a moment remarkably like his grandmother. "And that, Alexander, is exactly what Elizabeth hoped you would learn." As he drove home that night, past the glittering San Francisco skyline, Alex's phone lit up with another message from Patricia Chen. This one was different, a photo from the 1992 Heritage Week, showing his grandmother surrounded by smiling residents, many of whom he now recognized from their stories. In her arms, she held a toddler version of himself. The caption read, "Some choices echo through generations. Elizabeth would be proud of her grandson's reflection." Heritage Week began with an unexpected discovery. While helping Miss Betty set up her family history display, Alex found an old photograph tucked between the pages of a weathered album. It showed his grandmother, Elizabeth, much younger, standing in front of Golden Years with a group of residents. She was holding a document that made his heart skip a beat, the original deed to the nursing home. "Oh yes," Miss Betty said, noticing his surprise. "Your grandmother was one of the founding members of Golden Years, didn't you know? She and a group of local businesswomen bought this place when it was about to be torn down for condominiums. That was, must have been 1983. Alex stared at the photograph. Among the group of women, he recognized a younger Margaret and, once again, Patricia Chen. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together. "She used her inheritance from her grandmother to save this place." Margaret's voice came from behind him. "But she made us all promise never to tell you. She wanted you to learn about giving back on your own terms." Before Alex could process this revelation, the sound of music from the main hall signaled the start of the day's events. The Heritage Week celebration was beginning, and he had a dance performance to lead. The main hall had been transformed. Residents' family photos and cultural artifacts lined the walls. The air was filled with the scent of traditional foods prepared by families and staff. Mr. Thompson sat in the front row, his dance notation sheets in hand, ready to direct the performance he'd choreographed. "Ready?" he asked Alex, who was adjusting his dance costume, a blend of traditional elements representing the diverse backgrounds of the residents. "As ready as I'll ever be," Alex replied, thinking how surreal it was that a tech CEO was about to perform a cultural dance routine in front of a nursing home audience. The music began, and Alex led the group of residents through the carefully rehearsed movements. Mr. Thompson's choreography told a story of connection across generations, cultures merging and flowing together. As they danced, Alex caught glimpses of the audience, families recording on their phones, residents watching with tears in their eyes, Margaret standing in the back with a knowing smile. During Mrs. Chen's presentation later that day, she revealed something that made Alex's world shift again. Elizabeth Mitchell wasn't just a volunteer here, she said, showing slides from her early days at Berkeley. She was a pioneer in ethical technology development. In the 1980s, she wrote papers about the importance of maintaining human connection in an increasingly digital world. Her work was decades ahead of its time. Alex sat in stunned silence as Mrs. Chen displayed articles and research papers his grandmother had written. Ideas about technology serving humanity, about the importance of emotional intelligence in artificial systems. They were the same principles he was now implementing at Innovatech. thinking they were revolutionary new concepts. During the lunch break, he found a quiet moment to talk with Margaret in the garden. Why didn't anyone tell me about her work in technology? About her role in founding this place? Would it have meant the same if we had? Margaret asked. Your grandmother believed that true understanding comes from experience, not information. She wanted you to discover these truths for yourself. The afternoon brought Miss Betty's presentation about her family history, but it turned into something more. She had collected stories from other residents about Elizabeth Mitchell, creating a surprising tribute to Alex's grandmother. Elizabeth didn't just help save this place, Miss Betty said, her voice strong and clear.
She created a community. She taught us that wealth isn't just about money. It's about the richness of human connection. As residents shared their memories, a new picture of his grandmother emerged. She hadn't just been the kind woman who baked cookies and tended roses.
She had been a visionary who understood that progress without purpose was meaningless, that technology without humanity was empty. During a break in the presentations, Alex's phone buzzed with messages about the Singapore conference. The media was speculating about his absence, and competitors were filling the void with their own announcements. But as he watched Mr. Thompson reunite with his son, who had flown in from Europe to surprise him for Heritage Week, Alex knew he was exactly where he needed to be. Patricia Chen appeared beside him, having flown in from Singapore herself. You know, your grandmother turned down a lot more than just one conference to be here. She understood something that took me years to learn. That sometimes the biggest impact we can make isn't on a global stage, but in the small moments of human connection. Why didn't you ever tell me you knew her? Alex asked. Patricia smiled. Because Elizabeth made us all promise to let you find your own way. She believed that inherited wisdom only truly becomes our own when we discover it through experience. As the day wound down, Alex found himself sitting in his grandmother's rose garden. The evening light caught the heritage roses she had planted years ago, their blooms still vibrant and strong. In his hands, he held the photograph of the founding members of Golden Years. A resident he didn't recognize well, an elderly man who rarely left his room, approached slowly and sat beside him. I was the contractor who was supposed to demolish this place, the man said quietly. Your grandmother convinced me not to. She showed me a different kind of blueprint, one that built connections instead of condominiums, changed my whole life's direction. Ended up moving in here myself years later. He patted Alex's shoulder. Funny how history has a way of repeating itself in the best possible ways. Alex looked at the man, then back at the photograph in his hands. His grandmother's smile seemed to hold all the secrets he was only now beginning to understand. The true inheritance wasn't in a bank account or a legal document. It was in the legacy of connections she had built, the lives she had touched, and the wisdom she had known he would need to discover for himself. 9 months into his journey at Golden Years, Alex stood before his company's board of directors, presenting a radical new vision for Innovatech. The conference room walls were covered not with profit projections and market analyses, but with photos and stories from Golden Years residents. Our new AI platform isn't just about processing information faster, Alex explained, gesturing to a screen showing the interface. It's about understanding the human experience across generations. He clicked to the next slide, showing Mrs. Chen using the prototype to connect with her great-grandchildren in China. We've created something we call Legacy Bridge, a platform that helps older adults preserve and share their life stories, connect with family members, and maintain their independence through technology that adapts to their needs. Alex paused, watching his board members' reactions. But here's the real innovation. Every interaction teaches our AI more about human empathy, which improves all our other products. Patricia Chen leaned forward. The test results are remarkable. Customer satisfaction up 85%, user engagement increased by 200%, and emotional response metrics off the charts. But what's most impressive is the retention rate among elderly users. Because we're not just selling them technology, Alex said. We're giving them a voice, a connection, a way to share their wisdom with future generations. He switched to a video of Mr. Thompson using the platform to teach virtual dance classes to his grandchildren in Europe. Tom Reynolds, who had been skeptical of Alex's new direction, cleared his throat. The market potential is significant, but the development costs are already covered, Patricia interrupted. My firm is doubling our investment. This isn't just good ethics, it's good business. After the meeting, Alex headed to Golden Years for his afternoon shift. The place had changed over the months, or perhaps he had changed in how he saw it. The halls were now equipped with subtle but effective tech innovations, all prototypes from Innovatech, designed with input from the residents themselves. He found Mrs. Chen in the library, using a tablet to record her literary analysis of King Lear for her great-grandchildren. The device was adapted with larger text and voice controls, making it easy for her to use despite her arthritis. Shakespeare would have loved this, she said with a smile. To be or not to be digital, that is the question. In the recreation room, Mr. Thompson was leading a virtual dance class, his movements captured by sensors and transmitted to senior centers across the country. His son Michael appeared on the large screen, joining the class from Europe. Who would have thought, Mr. Thompson said during a break, that an old dance teacher could reach so many people without leaving the room? Your grandmother always said technology should bring people together, not push them apart. Alex helped Miss Betty set up for her weekly family video call, now enhanced with Innovatech's new emotional recognition software that adjusted lighting and sound based on the user's responses. You know, she said, adjusting her collar, Elizabeth would be so proud of how you've brought her vision to life. Later, in Margaret's office, Alex reviewed the progress of his year-long commitment. Only 3 months left, she noted. Having any second thoughts about the changes you've made? Alex looked out the window at the garden, where residents were using tablets to identify plants and share gardening tips with their families. Actually, I'm having first thoughts about a lot of things. He pulled out his notebook, not his phone, but an actual notebook, a habit he'd picked up from watching his residents record their stories. Innovatech is launching a new division, Legacy Technologies. We're converting the old warehouse near here into a tech center for seniors with free classes and support services. Mixing business with community service? Margaret raised an eyebrow. I learned from the best, Alex smiled. My grandmother didn't just leave money in a trust. She invested in people, in connections, in bringing worlds together. I'm just building bridges where she laid the foundations. His phone buzzed with a message from Sarah. Time magazine wants to interview you about the humanization of technology movement. They're calling you a pioneer. Alex chuckled, thinking of his grandmother's old research papers. If they only knew. Oh, they will, Margaret said, pulling out a familiar manila envelope. Your grandmother left something else for you. Inside was a manuscript, Elizabeth's unpublished book about technology and human connection, written decades ahead of its time. She wanted you to have this once you understood its real value, Margaret explained. Not as a historical document, but as a bridge between her vision and your future. That evening, as Alex read his grandmother's words, he felt the final pieces of her legacy falling into place. The inheritance had never been about money. It had been about understanding the true currency of life, the connections we build, the wisdom we share, and the bridges we create between hearts and minds. His phone buzzed again, this time with a photo from Mr. Thompson's virtual dance class. Seniors from around the world dancing together, their faces lit with joy. Below it was a quote he recognized from his grandmother's manuscript. Technology without humanity is like a dance without music. It may look right, but it will never feel right. Alex saved the photo, then turned back to the manuscript, ready to learn more from the woman who had known all along what he would need to discover for himself. With just 1 month left in his year-long commitment, Alex found himself back on the city bus where it had all begun. This time, though, he wasn't buried in his phone. Instead, he was helping an elderly gentleman with his groceries while chatting with a group of high school students about the Legacy Bridge app they were using to document their grandparents' stories. As he stepped off at his stop, he realized he hadn't thought about the inheritance in months. The $1 billion that had once seemed like the ultimate prize now felt almost incidental to the real wealth he'd discovered. At Innovatech's headquarters, The transformation was visible everywhere. The once sterile lobby now featured a community connection hub, where seniors taught coding classes to children, and children taught social media skills to seniors. The company's new motto, inspired by his grandmother's manuscript, hung prominently on the wall. Building bridges across generations. The Wall Street Journal piece just came out, Sarah announced, handing him a tablet as he walked in. The headline read, "Innovatech revolutionizes elder care technology. How one CEO's nursing home experience transformed an industry." But it was the smaller story below that caught his attention. Golden Years modeled to be replicated nationwide. The article detailed plans to create a network of technology-enhanced nursing homes based on the innovations Alex had implemented at Golden Years. "Mr. Mitchell?" A young programmer approached his office. The residents' feedback on the new memory-sharing feature just came in. Mrs. Chen suggested some Shakespeare-inspired interface quotes, and Mr. Thompson wants to add a dance tutorial section. Alex smiled, remembering how he'd once dismissed user feedback as irrelevant. Now, his most valuable product development insights came from the very people he'd once ignored. At Golden Years that afternoon, he found Margaret in a meeting with Patricia Chen and several other familiar faces, the children and grandchildren of the women who had founded the home with his grandmother. "Perfect timing," Margaret said. "We were just discussing the future of Golden Years." Patricia stood up. "The Board of Trustees is retiring, Alex. We need new leadership. People who understand both the traditional values of this place and the role of technology in its future." Alex looked around the room, understanding dawning. "Are you offering me a position on the board?" "Actually," Margaret said, "we're offering you the chairmanship. Your grandmother always intended for Golden Years to be part of your inheritance, not as a possession, but as a responsibility." "But the year isn't up yet," Alex pointed out. "The conditions of the will were never about the money," Patricia finished. Elizabeth knew that once you understood the true value of this place, the financial inheritance would be secondary. As if on cue, Mr. Thompson appeared at the door. "Alex, the virtual dance class network just reached 10,000 participants. Seniors from Tokyo to Toronto are dancing together." His son Michael waved from the tablet in his hand, teaching a group in Berlin. Walking through the halls later, Alex passed Mrs. Chen recording a dramatic reading of The Tempest for her literature appreciation app. She paused to show him how students from around the world were using AI to analyze Shakespeare through the lens of different cultural perspectives. In the garden, Miss Betty was hosting a virtual tea party with seniors from other nursing homes, sharing family stories through the Legacy Bridge platform. "You know," she said, adjusting her tablet's position, "your grandmother used to say that the future belongs to those who bridge the past with the present." As the day wound down, Alex found himself in Margaret's office, looking at the calendar where he'd been tracking his volunteer hours. The numbers had stopped mattering months ago, replaced by moments and memories that no spreadsheet could quantify. "You have a decision to make," Margaret said, placing a new document on her desk. The chairmanship of Golden Years would be a significant commitment, beyond what the will required. Alex picked up his grandmother's manuscript, which he now carried everywhere. "I used to think success meant having more money, more power, more technology. But grandmother knew it was about being more connected, more compassionate, more human." His phone buzzed with messages about the IPO, about expansion plans, about media interviews. But what caught his eye was a photo sent by one of the high school students from the bus, a selfie with his grandmother, both smiling as they used the Legacy Bridge app to record their family's immigration story. "The thing is," Alex said, looking out at the garden his grandmother had planted, where residents now used augmented reality tablets to learn about botany, "I'm not sure I ever really knew what inheritance meant until now." Margaret smiled, pulling out one last envelope. "Your grandmother left this for you, to be opened near the end of your year here. She somehow knew you'd reach this point." Inside was a single photograph, young Elizabeth with baby Alex in the Golden Years garden, surrounded by residents. On the back, in her familiar handwriting, "The greatest inheritance we leave is not what we own, but who we help others become." Alex looked up at Margaret, his decision already made. When can I start? 1 year to the day after that fateful bus ride, Alex stood in the Golden Years garden, watching the sunrise paint the roses in shades of gold. The same elderly lady who had once asked for his seat on the bus, Margaret, stood beside him, holding 2 envelopes. The original will stating the conditions of his inheritance, and his grandmother's final letter. "Shall we?" Margaret asked, her eyes twinkling with the same knowing look she'd worn that first day. The garden had been transformed over the past year, much like Alex himself. Traditional roses now grew alongside high-tech environmental sensors, while residents used augmented reality tablets to learn about gardening from experts worldwide. It was a perfect blend of the old and new, of wisdom and innovation, exactly what his grandmother had envisioned. "You know," Alex said, adjusting one of the garden's smart irrigation controls, "I always thought grandmother lived simply because she was old-fashioned. I never understood that she chose that life, even with all her wealth and knowledge. Elizabeth believed that true richness comes from what we give, not what we keep," Margaret replied. "Speaking of which," she handed him the original will. Alex held it for a moment, then did something that would have shocked his former self. He handed it back, unopened. "I don't need to see it anymore." "The money was never the real inheritance, was it?" Margaret's smile widened. "Read her letter first." Alex opened the envelope, recognizing his grandmother's elegant handwriting. "My dearest Alexander, if you're reading this, then you've completed your year at Golden Years, though I suspect it no longer feels like an obligation to you. You've likely discovered that this was never about the money. It was about helping you find what I discovered long ago, that our true wealth lies in the connections we build and the lives we touch. The billion-dollar inheritance is yours, as promised. But I know you've already received the far greater inheritance I hope to pass on. The understanding that success isn't measured in dollars, but in moments of human connection. You were always meant to bridge 2 worlds, Alexander. Your business acumen and your humanity aren't opposing forces. They're complementary strengths. Use them both to continue building bridges between generations, between technology and humanity, between profit and purpose. The money is in a trust managed by Margaret. Use it wisely, but remember, the real fortune is in the lessons you've learned and the connections you've made. All my love, Grandmother P.S. The roses need pruning in spring, but you already knew that, didn't you? Alex folded the letter, his vision blurring slightly. Around him, Golden Years was coming to life for another day. Mr. Thompson was setting up for his now famous international virtual dance class, his relationship with his son stronger than ever. Mrs. Chen was recording new Shakespeare lectures for the global educational platform they'd developed together. Miss Betty was preparing to mentor a new group of tech developers in understanding the needs of older users. "The board meeting is at 10, Margaret reminded him. "They're excited about your plans to expand the Golden Years model nationwide." Alex nodded, his mind already working on ways to integrate the latest AI advances with the human-centered care that made Golden Years special. Innovatech had transformed under his new vision, becoming a leader in humanitarian technology. The IPO had been a massive success, not despite but because of their focus on human connection. "One last thing," Margaret said, pulling out another envelope. "Your grandmother left instructions about setting up a foundation in her name. She thought you might have some ideas about how to use it." Alex watched as a group of high school students arrived for their weekly tech teaching session with the residents. The Legacy Bridge app had sparked a movement, with young people across the country connecting with seniors to preserve their stories and wisdom. "Actually," he said, "I think we should name it after all of them." He gestured to the residents who had taught him so much. Mr. Thompson, Mrs. Chen, Miss Betty, and all the others. The Bridge Builders Foundation, for people who connect generations, hearts, and minds. As if on cue, a city bus stopped outside Golden Years. A young executive stepped off, looking harried and checking his phone. A resident leaving for a doctor's appointment struggled with her walker. Alex smiled, knowing exactly what to do. He walked over and held the door for the elderly resident, then turned to the young executive. "Excuse me," he said. "Would you like to hear an interesting story about inheritance?" The executive looked up, startled by the interruption to his busy day, just as Alex had done a year ago. But unlike the strangers on his bus that fateful day, Alex now knew exactly how to build this bridge. "You see," he continued, guiding the man toward the garden, "my grandmother left me 2 inheritances. One was worth $1 billion, and the other was priceless. And it all started with a bus ride very much like yours." Inside Golden Years, Margaret watched through the window as Alex began sharing his story. She pulled out her old notebook, the same one she'd written in a year ago on the bus, and made one final entry. "Elizabeth, your garden is blooming beautifully, in more ways than one." The morning sun rose higher over Golden Years, its light touching the roses Elizabeth had planted, the technology her grandson had integrated, and the community they had both helped build. And in that light, it was impossible to tell where one inheritance ended and the other began, which was exactly as Elizabeth had planned it all along.